Welcome to the 2-minute warning interview, where we're going to dive into what's next and, most importantly, what should be next in the global energy transition. This is especially pressing and timely. We have COP26, the world's biggest climate-related gathering, just around the corner, opening its doors in Glasgow. My name is 𝗲𝗂𝘀𝗁. I'm the director of the Energy Transition Dialogues, and I am delighted to welcome Peter Godfrey with us. He is the Energy Institute's Managing Director of Asia Pacific. Peter, thank you very much for joining us. I know it's a really busy time with COP kicking off, and that there's major reports that have been coming out that need to be digested as well. So thank you for your time.
You're very welcome, Michelle. It's lovely to be here.
Thank you. Talking of COP, if you let's kick off with that. If you had on your wish list the top 3 things, or even top 1 or 2, if you want to really narrow it down, to come out of COP. We have this history with COP. I've been keeping an eye on it for about 15 years, and obviously others have been doing it far longer, yourself included, I'm sure, where there's such excitement leading up to it, and it never quite hits the mark. Obviously the Paris deal was closest that we're going to get to that mark. There was even some critics that was decades late. I mean, we could go into that for hours if we wanted to, but generally, a lot of excitement pre-COP, and then COP doesn't quite hit the mark, and there's disappointment afterwards, and we all gather our thoughts and think we have to be better, we have to be more ambitious for next time. This COP, we've had a year break. There's a lot more pressure on it, obviously, with all the momentum that we've seen in the last 18 months. The pressure is certainly building. On your wish list, what would you like to see come out of COP in regards to APAC?
Michelle, I guess the top 3 things on my list, as I brainstorm them in my brain, would be one around creating a just transition, by which I mean the issue of developed countries versus underdeveloped or developing countries. Up until now, clearly there has not been equity between the way these countries are looking at the whole issue of the energy transition. And we need to set some rules of the game, and those rules of the game have to recognize the need for justice in the way we move forward. So that would be number 1, and very much with an APAC focus in mind. Number 2, I think, would be one that is common for the globe, not just APAC, but that reverts to Article 6 within COP26, which is very much around the whole topic of carbon price discovery, and the need to come up with some rules of the game that will allow us to begin to start putting in regulatory frameworks, pricing frameworks, and market signals that will allow us to actually move forwards and actually create the pace and scale of transition that we need to achieve. So to me, those would be the 2 top issues. And then the third one actually has nothing to do with carbon whatsoever. Okay. It has very much to do with our conversation around the circular economy and a recognition that we constantly forget that we are addicted to our extractive resources, not just oil and gas, but coal, and everything that we take out of the ground. And at the end of the day, we need to start recognizing that we cannot continue to live in a world where our markets are dominated in terms of profits by the resource extraction industries.
I completely agree on all 3 of those, and just on the pricing side, and then we'll head into the circular economy, because it'd be great to make this conversation the bulk of this conversation. It's a huge one. Obviously, we won't cover everything, but it's just so ingrained in the way we live, in the way we think as well. And without addressing that, those 2050 goals just won't happen the way they need to. And on the pricing side, I mean, obviously we have seen a lot of developments. 1990, we had 2 carbon pricing initiatives worldwide. Now we have 64, according to the World Bank's dashboard. I recommend anybody who's interested in this to go look at that. It's very interesting. It shows a whole history of carbon pricing over the last 3+ decades. Do you feel that obviously we're lacking in it? We've got an issue with the cross-border carbon pricing architecture, and we're seeing developments on that with Europe, with the CBAM, and they're trying to make inroads with that. Do you see the right steps being put into place pre-COP? Obviously it's just around the corner, that can make it possible to have more development, more progress when it comes to cross-border pricing mechanisms? Do you think enough work has been done over the last 2 years for that to be a viable conversation?
I wish I could give you an answer to that question. I mean, a lot will be dependent on, as I say, the richer nations stomping up and actually putting in place the wherewithal to allow the poorer nations to actually get on with a relatively level playing field as we go forwards. So to my mind, the question is, how quickly will our multilateral institutions, will institutions like the World Bank, like the IMF, be given the wherewithal to actually create those sort of regulatory, mandatory systems that will actually become part of the global trading mechanism, not some vestigial wing that is looked at separately. It has to be part of the fundamental global trading system going forwards. And if we can take the first steps, that to me would be the ideal outcome.
And that is going to take a long time. Carbon pricing is not simple, but in its very nature, let alone when we're talking about cross-border, we're talking about different nations, geopolitical implications, different socioeconomic levels, climate factors as well within each of them. It's hugely, hugely complex. From your point of view, if we were able to establish not the final carbon pricing architecture, but huge progress towards it, and had a rough outline that countries were able to use, developing and developed, the vast majority were able to use by 2025. Is that far too soon, do you think? Are we looking more at 2030?
Well, firstly, I don't think there is a single price of carbon. I never have believed in a single price of carbon. So to me, the two mechanisms that need to be agreed is, number one, a recognition that just like tariffs in a trading mechanism, tariffs vary dependent on the type of trade that are made. So the variability and how that variability gets applied is what needs to be agreed. The rules of the game to establish that variability of tariffs and taxing systems within an economic system. And so that's, to me, the fundamental number one. The number two is a recognition that carbon pricing, in my opinion, cannot be actually determined without value chain focus. Because actually the carbon for one type of industry and the price that you put in place for one type of industry is going to be fundamentally driven by a different set of economic models to another economic system and another value chain. So again, we need to establish clearinghouses that are value chain focused. And without that, I don't see how it's possible.
And when do you think that is viable? Let's say all the momentum is in place, let's say all the right steps are being made, everyone's trying hard. Is it a late 2020s goal?
Well, you know, my view is if these fundamental things we've just talked about now can be agreed by the Conference of the Parties, COP, this time round, you know, just the fundamental principles,
that would be wonderful.
Then there is no reason why we shouldn't be able to move forward within, you know, a matter of a few years with the beginnings of some sort of rules of the game. The first thing is to establish the rules of the game by which we can set these frameworks.
I mean, I think that would be wonderful. What may happen, in my opinion, is that they'll establish a body to go and explore these things rather than pin down those details themselves, or something along those lines. I mean, obviously, you know, if we could get those sorts of details pinned down by mid-November, that'd be you know, astounding. That'd be fantastic. But also, you know, your top 3 wish lists, they're all very intertwined, aren't they? And they all support circular economy and those principles that were number 3 on your list and that we agree are absolutely critical. Just looking at the oil and gas sector, what sort of, let's start with where we're at now. What are the circular economy principles like in the oil and gas sector in APEC? How developed are they? What's the level of awareness?
Well, I think there's a relatively good level of awareness generally in terms of the energy sector, in terms of what the circular economy is. But there is a tendency
in APEC.
Within APEC as well. But there's a tendency when it comes to action to do 2 things. Number one, to think about your own business and your own business model. So, for example, and I would say this is also the case with Middle Eastern companies that are very much into the circular carbon economy, and you know what has happened within that context is the upstream side of the oil and gas business tends to say, well, we'll deal with the circular economy from an upstream perspective. Yeah. But at the end of the day, the customers tell us how many molecules to use, and we'll produce as many molecules as we possibly can because that's the way we make profits, instead of recognizing that the only way to get the circular economy really working is for everybody to have some responsibility within the complete value chain. So upstream needs to take more responsibility for downstream, and likewise downstream for upstream. And I think that part is still missing from this concept of where the circular economy will go. Because to me, the circular economy is all about fundamentally re-engineering the way we make, use, and return the resources and products that we use, not just energy, everything, right?
Oh, everything that we're looking at right now.
Yeah, and today, you know, the focus is very much our own business and how do I reduce waste? How do I create recycling from my perspective, instead of looking at the whole value chain and how we optimize that value chain from the point of view of creating that circularity that we need in order to reduce the number of resources that we're using. Do you know that, I mean, you know, if we continue to use just not oil and gas, but our extractive resources the way we are today, by 2050, we're going to require about double the amount that we're already using. And we are already consuming, in terms of extractive resources, again, as I say, not just oil and gas, coal, iron ore, it's something in the order of around 12 tons per person per year on this earth. So these are massive, massive numbers.
I think it's a good visual when you think of the fact that we need 2 planets essentially to meet the demand that we've got, you know, in terms of resources. We need 2 planets, 2 worlds of natural resources at the rate that we're going now. Clearly we don't have that. And that really highlights that black hole. It's a very good image that there's been circulating on LinkedIn and in these sorts of circles. And I'll try and flag it up on my page, but it's exactly what you just said in an image, and it really does hit home how short we are, and how stark the situation truly is.
Yeah, and you know, there are easy ways to fix that problem as well. So, for example, back to upstream having a share in downstream, what a difference it would make if an upstream oil and gas producer had to put part of their profits into ensuring that their molecules are being used energy efficiently, or where possible, being recycled as part of their business model. So effectively, that kind of mechanism, that kind of carrot and stick approach towards creating that circularity is what we need, in addition to the carbon pricing mechanisms that we talked about earlier.
Because there's another great figure just on that waste factor. Recycled plastics re-entering the economy are projected to more than triple by 2040. And over the same period, 86% of those plastics are projected to be landfilled, incinerated, or leaked into the environment. It's quite a scary idea. And this isn't to vilify plastics, and especially in the last 18 months, you know, every single person has seen the great value they play in medicine and other sectors. Again, most of the things we're looking at right now will be involved in that value chain. But the way it's managed, like you say, with the circular principles needs to be dramatically improved. And if you had to choose part, I mean, this is a hard question. I know you're probably going to want to say all of it, but if you had to choose parts of the value chain that really need the most focus in 2022, so product design, resource optimization, new consumption patterns, what would you really want to pin down?
Well, I think the way I'd like to say this is, rather than say all of the above, I'd like to say it's very much down to looking at the value chain focus of the way we do our business. So, for example, in the energy world, you know, if we go back to the early days of the oil and gas industry, or even before, the coal industry, it was set up very much on a resource-based global economy. So, you know, the developed countries going to the underdeveloped countries, exploiting the extractive resources, taking them back, and we created these incredibly long supply chains.
And then that waste sometimes going back to those developing countries.
All backwards and forwards. Now we have a set of technologies that allow us to reinvent those value chains. I call it the decentralization of energy, or the deglobalization of energy. You know, the fact that we can have solar cells or wind power or even nuclear at a local level, right? So we can create a much more localized solution to the problems that were technologically impossible in the past, right? So to me, that's what needs to drive it. It's all about efficiency. It's all about taking efficiency and creating more efficiency in the system. To be honest, a very large part of our global economy has been based on the discontinuities in a supply chain,
absolutely,
as opposed to the efficiencies in a supply chain.
From a profitability point of view, you know, exactly.
So how do we move from the one to the other? That's the fundamental question, and that requires you to look at value chains and actually optimize or start optimizing each one of them with a set of clear strategies and a set of clear frameworks that can take us from an economy that we built 150 years ago to something that is actually fit for purpose for tomorrow.
And also when it comes to renewable energy market and all the products and materials that are being developed now for things, solar farms, wind farms, and so on, they are using a lot of materials, and in a lot of cases those recycling and reuse processes do not exist. Look at the Middle East, is ramping up some of the world's biggest renewable energy products, which is great, and projects, which is great, and it's pursuing those as it's set out in its national visions, as it's trying to sustain its position on the global energy stage as an energy leader, obviously as the fossil fuels eventually take a much bigger backseat. So it's in that sense, it's very much being proactive and doing the right thing, but there's this big gap at the end of the chain where there are no clear roadmaps in place of what happens to these materials, what happens to the turbines once they come to the end of their life, how is that material reused, how's it appropriately remanufactured, and so on. Do you see that happening in APAC, and also generally, what is your view? What would you like to see done?
So just coming back to your comment about bioplastics and recycling and, you know, biodegradable plastics and all that kind of stuff, I totally agree with you. You know, that right now a lot of people are doing a lot of things, and that a lot of technology innovators are coming up with great ideas. What's actually missing right now, and you know, I look at my logo behind me, the Energy Institute, is actually the need to create standards, the need to create guidelines. Okay, so what we have is a lot of innovation that's going on, but we're actually lacking any true rules of the game that can be globally applied. So for example, you know, there are people have done studies of biodegradable plastics and found that they've been put into a landfill for 3 years and they're still perfectly okay again, because nobody's actually in any way enforcing any form of standard or guideline. So at the end of the day, that's where there's a commitment as well. There is a need for industry to step up to the mark and create guidelines and standards that can not only be applied by their own industry from their own perspective, but on a much broader scale. And that's missing. Why? Because nobody's stomping up the money to make that happen, right? So this is where institutes such as the Energy Institute and sort of clearing houses need to be established in order to make these rules of the game work and be adhered to, because otherwise, how's it going to happen? And
as you say, be adhered to. So when you're in that phase of innovation and R&D and so on, I guess innovation is only when it's being commercialized, but when you're in the R&D phase and you're developing a product, that there are the boxes you have to tick are so much more stringent when it comes to the reusability of that product later on. And it's that sort of thing, getting those rules in place. So yes, you've created this renewable energy product, which is great, or this component for such, but before it goes to commercial market, you absolutely must ensure you know what its end life is going to be. You need to be able to tell me what will happen in 15 years time when it finishes, which project, you know, which project or plant you hope it will be able to go to be remanufactured, reused, how you think it's, you know, end use for this project before it goes on to the next one. It's that sort of detail that's still lacking.
Yeah, and I would say, you know, if you look at the sort of high level of this, you know, the ultimate American capitalist will say, well, you don't need to bother, the market drives everything. I would argue exactly the opposite and say that I don't know a market that exists that isn't regulated in some way. And therefore, let's stop pretending that the market can drive everything and that everything is a free-for-all. including the internet, including Facebook. Let's actually start working on creating some simple and straightforward frameworks that can drive us into the future, instead of thinking we all do this on a whim and a prayer going forwards.
It's a scary idea, isn't it, really?
Yeah, but there we are. That's where I come from, because I'm an old man and I can have these silly conservative ideas. But
I agree with you. It's the whole wing and a prayer side of it that scares me a little bit. Well, Peter, thank you so much for joining us. We've covered quite a bit. I think rules of the game is a key message from everything you've been saying. It comes into play with carbon pricing and getting that architecture set up on a more global basis. It comes into play with the reuse of materials. Comes into play with also finance. We haven't even touched on finance and how that plays into the circular economy. There's so much to talk about, and that your three wish lists coming out of COP as well, which I really hope for all our sakes are realized as well. And like I say, we've only really touched the top parts of the circular economy, so I really hope you'll be able to join us again, and we can go into more detail when it comes to the technology side, when it comes to value chains, when it comes to finance as well, more of a granular look at what is needed to get circular principles really into play. And hopefully when we do chat, we'll have some big progress out of COP as well.
Let's hope so. Fingers crossed. And thank you very much for the discussion.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Peter.
All the best. Thank you.
You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.